Hi everybody, welcome to the final class of ECO335. We're in week 13 and we will be covering chapter 13, which is economic integration. Last week we covered chapter 12, which dealt with trade organizations. A quick overview of what we're going to be doing. Firstly, we're going to start by looking at the main types of economic integration, and our focus is going to be here in terms of the European Union. Then we're going to look at the benefits and costs of economic integration, and that entails us looking at trade creation and trade diversion. Then we're also going to look at regionalism, and we're going to look at some of the possible dangers of regionalism. And then lastly, we're going to show some comprehensive examples of the EU, which is the largest and most complex economic integration. Firstly, the first form of economic integration is a preferential trade agreement, and that's just the idea that trade restrictions are reduced for certain goods and services. Bear in mind, not all, only for certain goods and services. When you want all goods and services to be reduced, then you maybe deal with a free trade area. That is where a couple of countries, they group together and then they decide, okay, we're going to reduce all the tariffs or all the trade restrictions for all our goods and services between all the countries that is joining this free trade area. So that is your internal restrictions, the policy for all members that belong to the free trade area. And then unfortunately these countries also deal with non-members, people that don't belong to the free trade area, and that's your common external trade policy. Now, each member of the free trade area, they can decide that we will have a different policy from the other members in the free trade area when dealing with other countries that are non-members. Right? That's usually the case with the free trade area. But when we move to a customs union, it is exactly a free trade area, except that additionally to the idea that we eliminate all internal restrictions, we are also going to have a common external policy. So how each member deals with foreign countries is exactly the same in terms of trade policy. And then we have a common market, which is everything which a custom unit is, but it also looks at the idea of factors of production. And here we are allowing factors of production to move between countries that are members. So labor can move between the countries and capital can move between the countries. And then lastly, we have an economic union, which is exactly a common market, except now that we're looking at having harmonization of institutions and policy coordination. So it's almost like all these countries that are banding together now work as one exactly. Yes, there's another thing to this. You can even move to a political union, but that is something that you can go and research and learn more about. So if I ask you about the types of economic integration, or if I ask you for the linear model for economic integration, then I'm referring to the idea of moving from a preferential trade agreement to a free trade area, to a customs union, to a common market, to an economic union, exactly in that order. So just bear that in mind, because the linear model of economic integration is the most commonly used form of trying to incorporate economic integration, especially for Africa. And when you come next year and do ECO's 735, and then you will do a lot more articles and research that deals with economic integration in Africa as a whole. If we look in terms of the number of regional trade agreements, what we can see is that over time it has increased. With trade creation, we can assume there are two countries, country B and country C. We can assume country B is the more efficient producer, and we can also assume that country B and country C is selling the same good to our country. Since it is trading with an international company, there is a tariff in place to protect the local market, The tariff is the same for country B and for country C, meaning that the prices that country A will charge towards the world will still be lower than that of country C, even when taking into account the tariff. What happens from the domestic side, from our side, regardless of which country is trading, we're going to buy the product from the cheapest country. And in this case, when there's a tariff in place, we will still buy from the more efficient country. While trading with a more efficient producer, country B. What is going to happen now is the idea of how do we actually create trade or how do we actually divert trade. So we're either going to enter into a custom union or a trade agreement with country B, or we're going to enter into a trade agreement with country C. In order for trade creation to occur, we need to enter into a trade agreement with a more efficient producer. And we'll show why. And also, for us to show what trade diversion is or a loss to our society, then we will show what it is to enter into a trade agreement with the least efficient producer. So what this graph actually shows is that when you enter into a trade agreement with the efficient producer, you are actually having your initial imports increasing. So imports increases when you enter into a trade agreement. That's the thing that you need to identify here. Because initially speaking, you are trading with an efficient producer. When the tariffs are removed, because you enter into a trade agreement with country B, then you are then going to import more because the prices are lower, meaning there is actually more quantity demanded than initially, and there is actually less being supplied initially, implying that imports are actually increasing. So what does it mean that imports are increasing? What does that imply for producers and consumers? So with a lower price, what is occurring? There is actually an increase in consumer surpluses. But also with a lower price, which is now more competitive, and maybe some of the firms locally can't compete with it, it is causing less to be supplied locally, meaning producer surplus is actually decreasing. But what is also occurring? That is, besides the increase in consumer surplus and besides the decrease in producer surplus, there is also a decrease in government revenue. No longer is the tariff involved. So there's no tariff, there is no money that the government can actually make. If you look in terms of the diagram, what does that mean? What is the increase in the consumer surpluses? It is all the shapes between the two green lines. So that means it's the blue shape, and then the checkered green shape, and then the striped brown shape. That is the gain in consumer surplus. What is the loss in producer surplus? The loss in producer surplus is the blue shape. What is the loss in government revenue? The loss in government revenue is the brown stripe shape. So if you then compare your gain in consumer surplus and you compare your loss in producer surplus and you compare your loss in government revenue, then we find that consumer surplus is more than those two added together. So consumer surplus is more than the sum of the loss of producer surplus and government revenue. And that is exactly equal to the two checkered triangles. In other words, if you look at that, it's very familiar. It almost looks like half-budget triangles. Suppose now that we enter into a trade agreement with the least efficient producer or the more costly producer. What does that mean for our domestic country, or for, if we call ourselves country A? What does that mean for country A? It means that, yes, we are going to experience an increase in imports, but is that going to be better, or an increase in welfare for a country, or are we going to experience a loss in welfare for our country? Prior to everything, when these tariffs are in place against both countries B and country C, we find that we are still buying from the more efficient producer, which is country B, even when the tariffs are included. But now, when we enter into this trade agreement with country C, the tariff is not removed from country B. We don't have any agreement with that, so we're not expecting the tariffs to fall away. But because of our trade agreement, the tariff is falling away from country C, meaning that the price that country C is now putting forth to us, or the price that we now face in terms of our imports, is now lower for country C than it would be for country B, because unfortunately country B still has a tariff in place. And as we can see is that with a lower price, or the lower price that we faced before, is that imports are going to increase. So what are we going to show is that, okay, this least efficient producer is actually trade diversion. And we're going to do that in terms of little color triangles as we've done before. In order to show the trade diversion, we need to analyze the net welfare effect. That means we need to look at the changes in terms of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue. What you need to understand is that we initially were trading with country B. Now we enter into a trade agreement with country C. And that means we are losing the revenue that we would have gained from the tariff that was imposed on country B. So government is losing out, we're not gaining tariff. Because we're now with our arrangement with country C, we're entering into fully free trade, meaning no tariff involved. So that means government loses out the brown stripe box and the bronze rectangle. That is what is being lost for government. So no more government revenue. In terms of producers, the lower price is causing a loss in producer surplus, and that is represented by the blue shape. For consumers, on the other hand, the reduced prices is actually a gain. That is coming from the increase in imports. And the gain is exactly equal to the blue shape, the striped round shape, and the checkered triangles. That is your gain. Ultimately, you need to compare consumer surplus gain to the losses in terms of government revenue and the losses in terms of producer surplus. And what that means then at the end is that the losses are actually outweighing the gain in terms of consumer surplus. And that loss is a portion of the government revenue, which is the bronze box. And so now we've shown that by entering into a trade agreement with a least efficient producer or more costly producer actually leads to trade diversion and not actually trade creation that could have occurred if we had entered into a relationship or trade agreement with country B. Moving from the types of economic integration and trade creation and trade diversion, we're going to look at regional trade agreements, and we're going to highlight some of the deficiencies for COMESA. So those are all the yellow highlighted countries on the African map. The first thing we notice for the COMESA countries is that population size does not necessarily translate into trade. Meaning, if you have a higher population size, it would mean that you also would have a higher volume of trade. And this is shown by Libya. Libya actually has quite a small population size, but it has the highest amount of trade of the COMESA countries. We also have the Asian Regional Trade Agreement that has occurred, and those are also again the countries highlighted in yellow. Similar to the data from COMESA, we again can look at the population size and the trade volume, and we can find that a smaller country actually has the highest volume or highest value of trade. And if we actually look at the exact figures, we find that the figures for these Asian countries are actually a lot more in terms of trade value than that of COMESA countries. Here we have a world map of North America and South America and the regional trade agreements that exist. And we find that the regional trade agreement for North America almost encompasses the whole of the continent. So that Mexico and United States and Canada, which form part of NAFTA, and they're quite huge in size of or percentage area of North America. While if we just move a bit south and we find there is a lot more smaller regional trade agreements that exist in the south of America. If we then compare the regional trade blocks between each other, we find that the EU actually dominates in terms of the trade from block to block, meaning from one country in the block to another country in the block. It even dominates the exports from what happens within the block and then sent outside towards the rest of the countries of the world. And then it also dominates in terms of import from getting from the rest of the world and bringing it towards the block or towards this region in a sense. So you find that if you look at it, it's mostly the more developed blocks, which is the EU and NAFTA that dominates, and this is actually followed by the Asian countries. So the World Trade Organization is all about multilateral trade liberalization, meaning reducing tariffs amongst all countries and between all countries. Unfortunately, this process has become very difficult and time consuming in the latter part of the 20th century. The progress was also slowing down, which made countries think about other ways in terms of reducing tariffs among countries. And they thought, okay, regional trade agreements is probably the best. But we can also show that if we apply the Paul Krugman model, the inter-industry trade model that you're familiar with, or what they call the new trade model, we can find there's actually issues with implementing a regional trade model. And we can show that the driving force for negative wealth effects has got to do with the variety wall. What do you mean variety wall? What did the Krugman model say about variety? More variety is better. But you can influence the amount of variety you have through prices. And if the distortion in prices is quite hectic, then it can cause a negative impact for your regional block. What do I mean by price distortions being hectic or large? Price distortion is what? The tariff that you put on the original price. So if there's a lot of price distortions that is actually occurring, you are actually curbing the amount of variety for your country. But now we're just thinking of this in terms of the regional block. If you have lots of price distortions or bad price distortions, which we found is quite a core part of COMESA or of African regionalism, then we find that through this price distortions, we're actually having negative wealth effects because we're actually affecting the type of variety that is actually present in these regions. Now, if you do a bit more study of it, you find that when there's few large blocks, then the distortion is actually maximized, or the tariffs are actually quite a high setup. So that what that means is then when you're having a larger tariff being in place because of these large blocks, then you're actually having your welfare decrease. So the distortions, when in place in a large block or in a few large blocks, they actually cause welfare minimization. And we're going to show a bit of that on the next slide. And therefore, that there are dangers in regionalism which actually push forward for the idea that let's go back to multilateralism. So let's go to this idea of actually having free trade amongst all countries without needing to use regionalism to attain it. If we look at the number of trading blocks and welfare, we can actually analyze that welfare is minimized when we're actually dealing with a small number of trading blocks, regardless of the level of tariff. I'm not actually going to go through the side, but this just shows the European Union integration when certain members join, what it was called initially, until what it has become up till today. And we know now that England or Great Britain has actually left the EU. So what is the European economic integration? As it stands, it's the highest level integration that has been achieved in terms of economic integration. What it implies is this movement of goods freely between the two countries, there's free movement of people between two countries, so that is in terms of labor or access of people to visit, there's free movement in terms of services, there's free movement in terms of capital. They also have lots of types of institutions. They have a Council of the European Union, they have a Commission, a Parliament, a Court of Justice, and a central bank. So this is the highest level that can be achieved if we ignore the idea of giving up sovereignty or of becoming a political union. And then this graph is just trying to depict the expansion of the European Union in terms of members. And I'm not going to look in terms of that. It's obvious as more countries join that the population of the EU is going to actually increase. But it's just also important to understand which country is joined at what time. It's not something that is really testable. It's just trying to give us an idea of how many countries the EU actually had and when most of the countries actually joined. This is not too different from what we've seen earlier. This depiction of the European continent is just showing the expansion of the EU as members are joining or as other countries are joining. And in trying to bring some data to the historical context, we find that generally speaking, the first 15 members of the EU generally have a higher GDP per capita level than all the other countries that join later and some of the candidates that are trying to be part of the EU. If we were to relate the GDP growth for the EU to some other well-known countries like the USA and China, the EU has generally been the second highest in terms of GDP levels over a 60-year period from 1950 to 2010. And it has also featured in the top 3 growth rates in terms of GDP for the same period. The other two countries that is actually involved in terms of this higher growth rates is the USA and China. In terms of population size, we find that the EU has the third highest population size when compared to China and India. If we then were to consider GDP per capita, which is the idea of taking GDP and adjusting it for population size, we find that the EU performs quite well still has relatively good growth in GDP per capita, and actually is in third place. And quite surprisingly, Japan is actually the second best in terms of GDP growth from the 1980s to 2000. Or not in terms of growth, in terms of its actual levels of GDP per capita. And China then actually doesn't feature so highly as you would have seen in terms of the population size and in terms of the standard levels of GDP. So in per capita terms, China is not actually so great. Then we can also look from a local perspective. We can look at South African trade agreements, we can look at SACU, we can look at the South African Development Community, we can look at what countries are involved, and the products that are involved and the type of agreements that is in place. And you can look through this table and you can Google a bit further if you want to learn more about these agreements. But this is just some idea of what South Africa trade agreements look like. In conclusion, what we looked at is the different types of economic integration. We looked at removing trade restrictions and how that has led to trade creation and trade diversion. And we also looked at regionalism, we looked at the bads of regionalism, and then we looked at also the European Union. We looked at the historical context of them, and then we have looked at them in terms of their population and their GDP. What you as a student need to take away from this lecture is the different types of economic integration. You must be able to provide some discussion on economic integration, on a preferential trade agreement, on a free trade agreement, on a customs union, on a common market, on an economic union. You need to be able to do that type of discussion. And then you also should be able to do a discussion on trade creation and trade diversion. That's the most important things that you need to take away from this. I'm not going to ask you to provide me with historical context of the EU, but I do want you to understand the success of the EU. That is important to take away also from the class, but not as important as the first things that I mentioned now.